Some people do not stay in your life because they are meant to return. They stay because something in you is still arranged around them. That is the part most people miss when they talk about letting go. They imagine letting go as an emotional decision, when very often it is a structural one. You can decide someone is over. You can say the right words, create distance, stop checking their page, stop speaking their name, and still feel them moving through your field like weather that has not fully passed. This is why some endings refuse to feel finished. It is not always because the bond is alive in the present. Sometimes it is because the bond built rooms inside you. You are still living in them. What keeps a person lodged in your inner world is not always love. Sometimes it is unfinished meaning. Sometimes it is the role they played in your nervous system. Sometimes it is the version of yourself that only existed around them and has nowhere else to go yet. You may think you are grieving them, when what you are actually grieving is the collapse of a pattern that once gave your life a certain shape. That is why these bonds can feel so confusing. You may not even want the person back, yet part of you still circles them. You may know they were wrong for you, yet your body still reacts as if something essential is missing. You may have all the insight in the world and still feel emotionally tethered. This is what happens when attachment is being held less by thought and more by structure. People often assume that intensity proves destiny. If someone marked you deeply, if you cannot forget them, if the bond keeps resurfacing across months or years, the mind wants to call it sacred or fated. But intensity is not always revelation. Intensity is sometimes evidence that a person's presence fused with a wound, a need, or a threshold in you that was already waiting to be touched. That distinction matters because it changes what healing asks of you. If you think the bond remains because the universe is trying to bring you back together, you will keep reading longing as instruction. If you see that the bond remains because a pattern in you still orients around what that person represented, then the work becomes different. You stop asking whether they are coming back and start asking what still rearranges itself in you when they appear in memory. You begin to notice that some people become inner architecture because they entered you during a season of openness, fragility, or transformation. They were there when you were becoming someone new, or when you were falling apart, or when you were starving for recognition. Their presence wrapped around a developmental moment, and because of that, they began to feel larger than themselves. They became linked not only to who they were, but to who you were while knowing them. This is why replacement rarely works. You cannot simply meet someone new and expect the old tether to vanish, because the old tether was never just about companionship. It was tied to meaning, identity, and emotional imprint. Another person may be healthier, clearer, kinder, and still not touch the same layer. That does not prove the old bond was higher. It often proves it was embedded deeper. You can see this most clearly in the way memory behaves. When an ordinary relationship ends, memory fades in a mostly linear way. But with an echo bond, memory does not fade linearly. It returns in pulses. It gets triggered by seemingly unrelated moments, by songs, by seasons, by physical sensations, by moods that have nothing to do with the present but still pull the old pattern back online. That is because echo bonds are not stored like information. They are stored like pathways. They live in the routes your system learned to travel. The mind may no longer choose them consciously, but your deeper patterning still knows the road. So when life creates a familiar emotional atmosphere, the old bond lights up again, not because the person is necessarily calling you, but because your internal route was never fully rerouted. This can make people feel weak when they are not weak at all. They think, I should be over this by now. They confuse recurrence with failure. But recurrence is often just a sign that understanding has not yet reached the level where the bond was originally installed. You may have clarity at the level of thought, while still carrying attachment at the level of identity, body, memory, or self worth. That is where letting go becomes more than detachment. Detachment alone can become another defense. You can harden yourself, call it closure, and still remain internally organized around the very thing you claim to have released. Real release happens when the structure loses relevance, when the route is no longer needed, when the self that kept returning to that bond has actually been met, reworked, and given a new place to live. This is also why chasing contact often makes the bond louder, not quieter. You think one more message, one more conversation, one more explanation will settle it. But if the tether is structural, contact does not resolve it. Contact often reactivates the very pattern you are trying to understand. It gives temporary relief while deepening the route, because the system reads reunion as confirmation that the old pathway still matters. You may notice something unsettling once you begin watching this more honestly. What you miss may not be the person in front of you. What you miss may be the emotional arrangement that their presence allowed, the hope, the ache, the unfinished possibility, the version of yourself that felt chosen, seen, destabilized, or alive in a very specific way. And once you see that, the bond becomes less romantic and more revealing. That does not make it less meaningful. It often makes it more meaningful because now the bond stops being a riddle about another person and becomes a living map of your own inner design. You begin to see what kind of presence enters deeply into you, what kind of timing makes a bond unforgettable, what kind of unmet need can disguise itself as spiritual inevitability. You stop treating the attachment as proof of fate and begin treating it as evidence of where your system still seeks completion. From there, even grief starts to change shape. You are no longer only grieving the loss of a person, you are grieving the collapse of an arrangement that once organized your emotional world. That grief is heavier at first because it is less dramatic and more honest. It asks you to feel what the bond did in you rather than what the person did for you. And those are not the same thing. As this becomes visible, a quieter question starts to rise. If some people remain because they became structure, then release is not going to come from suppressing memory or demonizing connection. It will come from learning how the bond was built, what it was holding in place, and what must be reformed in you so their absence no longer feels like a missing piece. And once that question becomes real, the bond begins to reveal more than the person ever could. What makes this even harder is that the bond often survives the facts. You can know exactly why it did not work. You can understand the incompatibility, the inconsistency, the damage, the misalignment, and still feel the pull. That is usually the moment people start mistrusting themselves because they assume understanding should instantly dissolve attachment, when in reality, attachment often outlives explanation by a long distance. This happens because explanation works on one layer while the bond may be installed across several others. Your mind can register truth much faster than your deeper patterning can reorganize around it. A person can be wrong for your life and still be entangled with your body memory, your longing, your sense of worth, or your internal idea of what intimacy feels like. So the contradiction is not proof that you are weak. It is proof that human attachment is never built in only one place. You can see this in the way certain people stay linked to specific emotional atmospheres. They may rise in you whenever you feel lonely, unseen, unchosen, restless, or suspended between identities. That tells you the bond is not simply about them. It tells you they became associated with a certain inner state, and now that state calls them back every time it reappears. The person became a symbol, but not an abstract one, a living symbol embedded in the routes your emotional life still travels. That is why release cannot happen through force alone. You cannot yell your way out of a pathway that your system still depends on. You cannot shame yourself into freedom from a bond that once functioned like structure. And you cannot simply decide to stop feeling something when the feeling itself is being produced by deeper associations that have not yet been updated. Letting go becomes possible when the system no longer needs the rope. not when the mind finally gets angry enough to reject it. This is also why people sometimes confuse attachment with intuition. They feel the bond return, they feel the person internally, they notice the resurfacing is persistent, and they assume the universe must be signaling reunion. But a recurring signal does not always mean forward movement. Sometimes it means the system is still circling an unresolved pattern. Sometimes what feels spiritually charged is actually emotionally unfinished. And until you can tell the difference, longing will keep disguising itself as revelation. You may notice something important when you begin watching this honestly. True intuition tends to clarify. It may be strong, but it usually leaves you more coherent after it lands. Echo bonds do something different. They often intensify confusion while preserving attachment. They keep the person psychologically central without necessarily making the path clearer. That does not mean the bond is false. It means the bond may be functioning less like guidance and more like recursion. Recursion is what happens when the psyche keeps returning to the same unfinished site because it still believes something essential is there. The site may be love, it may be pain, it may be identity, it may be the hope that this time the old wound will resolve differently. What matters is not just that you return, but why return still feels necessary. The repetition itself is information. It tells you that the bond is still doing internal work, whether or not it belongs in your external life anymore. This is where the difference between memory and occupation becomes useful. Memory is normal. Memory is what happens when someone mattered. Occupation is different. Occupation is when the bond continues to organize emotional attention, self-concept, fantasy, and expectation long after the relationship has stopped feeding reality. Memory visits. Occupation settles in, and if you do not notice the shift from one into the other, you will keep mistaking persistent inner occupancy for proof that the bond will still be alive in the same way it once was. A lot of people get stuck here because they are trying to end the feeling without understanding the function. They want peace, so they attack the symptom. They cut off thought, suppress emotion, distract the nervous system, and call that movement. Sometimes that helps temporarily. But if the bond was carrying unmet need, unformed identity, or unresolved grief, suppression does not release it. It simply drives it deeper, where it continues shaping choice, attraction, and longing from below the surface. That is why release tends to look less dramatic than people expect. It often begins as understanding rather than severance. You start to see what the bond was built around. You start to notice which inner states make it louder. You begin separating the actual person from the internal structure attached to them. And as that separation becomes clearer, the bond starts losing some of its mythic power. Not because it meant nothing, but because it no longer gets to define itself without examination. You may realize, for example, that what felt like irreplaceable love was partly the experience of finally being mirrored at a time when you felt unknown, or that what felt like soul recognition was partly the shock of being deeply seen by someone who also activated your oldest instability, or that what felt impossible to release was tied to the fact that this person entered during a threshold where your life was already cracking open. Those recognitions do not cheapen the bond, they make it legible. Once a bond becomes legible, the next question changes. You stop asking how to get rid of them and start asking, what in you still responds as if they are necessary? That is a deeper question because it shifts the focus from object to mechanism. It is no longer only about what they meant. It is about what role they continue to play in your system. And when you know the role, you finally begin to understand what must be built differently for the bond to stop running the same pattern. Sometimes the role is stabilizing fantasy. The person represented possibility, and possibility itself became addictive because your present life felt too narrow. Sometimes the role is emotional intensity. The bond gave you access to aliveness, and now calm feels empty by comparison. Sometimes the role is self-worth. Their attention became evidence of value, so their absence still registers like a drop in significance. If you do not identify the role, you will keep trying to solve the wrong problem. This is where healing becomes more specific. You do not just need closure from them. You may need a way to experience aliveness that is not built on emotional volatility. You may need a form of self-recognition that does not depend on being chosen by a specific person. You may need to widen your present life so that old possibility no longer holds monopoly over your imagination. In other words, release often requires replacement at the level of function, not necessarily at the level of person. That has major implications for how people move forward relationally. If you carry an unexamined echo bond into a new connection, you may compare without realizing it. Not always in obvious ways, but through energy. The new person may feel too calm, too clear, too real, because they are not entering through the same old route. You may interpret that as lack of chemistry when what you are actually feeling is the absence of your familiar pattern. This is why some people keep returning to old bonds in fantasy while rejecting healthier bonds in life. The issue is not that healthy love is less powerful. It is that healthy love often does not arrive through the same wound. It does not necessarily produce the same immediate recognition because its function is different. It is not there to complete an old internal loop. It is there to create something new. And if the psyche is still organized around old looping, newness can feel emotionally undercharged at first. This is why the work cannot stop at insight. Insight may show you that the bond is structural, but life has to give you new experiences that prove other structures are possible. You need moments of steadiness that do not feel dead. You need closeness that does not depend on instability. You need self-contact strong enough that someone can leave your life without taking your entire emotional architecture with them. Those experiences do not erase the old bond instantly, but they begin to make its hold less total. At some point, you start to feel the difference between a bond that is still alive and a bond that is still patterned. One invites movement, clarity, and real contact. The other keeps circling the same psychological terrain, even if it does so with enormous feeling. Learning that difference may be one of the most important forms of maturity in attachment, because it teaches you that not everything powerful is pointing forward. And once that becomes visible, the bond begins to reveal not only why it stayed, but what it has been asking you to become in order for staying to no longer be necessary. What begins to loosen the bond is not forgetting, it is reorganization. You stop trying to erase the person and begin learning how to live without giving them central structural authority inside you. That shift matters because forgetting is passive and unreliable, while reorganization is active and transformative. A person can remain meaningful in memory without remaining formative in your inner architecture. This is why release often feels less like an emotional breakthrough and more like 1,000 quiet corrections. You notice the urge to return to the old internal route, and instead of following it all the way, you pause long enough to see what state is asking for it. Sometimes it is loneliness. Sometimes it is boredom. Sometimes it is the old ache of not feeling chosen in your present life. The more clearly you identify the state, the less automatically the old bond gets to define what happens next. That is the mechanism most people miss. Echo bonds survive through automatic association. The inner system learns that a certain kind of emptiness leads to a certain person, and after enough repetition, the jump becomes instantaneous. You do not feel yourself making a choice. You simply find yourself there again. Reorganization begins when the space between trigger and return gets slightly wider, because that is where a new pathway can finally be built. At first, that wider space can feel disappointing rather than victorious. You may have imagined healing would feel dramatic, like suddenly not caring, suddenly becoming free, suddenly feeling nothing where everything used to burn. But actual release is often quieter than that. It looks like noticing the pattern before it fully possesses you. It looks like feeling the pull without obeying it. It looks like surviving the old ache long enough to discover that the ache is not the same thing as instruction. You also begin to understand that not every remaining tenderness means the bond still belongs in your life. Some tenderness is simply the residue of depth. A person can matter without being meant to continue. A chapter can shape you without needing to reopen. Once that becomes emotionally real, longing loses some of its old persuasive power, because you no longer treat intensity as command. This has major implications for how you interpret memory. Before, memory may have felt like evidence that the bond was unfinished in the external sense. Now, memory becomes evidence that the internal process is still integrating with the bond stirred. That subtle difference changes the entire field. You stop asking what memory means about them and begin asking what memory is revealing about you now. The person recedes from the center, and the pattern begins to come into focus. You may notice that this also changes how you speak to yourself. Shame usually says, I should be over this. Wisdom says, something in me still organizes around this, and I want to understand why. Shame treats recurrence as weakness. Wisdom treats recurrence as information. That shift is not softness for its own sake. It is precision, because self-condemnation usually drives the bond deeper, while honest observation begins to loosen its function. The role of the body becomes especially clear here. Some bonds are not kept alive by belief so much as by chemistry, rhythm, and conditioned activation. Your body learned their unpredictability, their attention, their withdrawal, their specific timing, and it built an internal map around those fluctuations. That is why calm can feel empty at first. The body is not only missing the person, it is missing the pattern of stimulation it once interpreted as significance. This is where many people accidentally return to what harmed them. They mistake familiar activation for deep truth. They assume that because someone affects them strongly, that effect must mean something elevated. But strong effect and good effect are not the same thing. When you understand that, you become less vulnerable to the old confusion between emotional charge and genuine alignment. That understanding also begins to reshape your standards. You stop asking only, does this person move me? You start asking, what happens in me over time around them? Do I become clearer or more fragmented? Do I return to myself or orbit them more intensely? Do I become more honest, more grounded, more expanded, or do I become preoccupied, destabilized, and internally rearranged around uncertainty? Those are much more useful questions because they move you from romantic interpretation into structural discernment. As discernment deepens, you may grieve in a new way. Not only the person, not only the ending, but the years of inner life you spent circling something that could not actually become what you needed it to be. That grief can feel humiliating if you read it through ego, but through a clearer lens, it is simply the grief of recovering time, energy, and selfhood from a pattern that once held too much influence. It is not foolish to grieve that. It is honest. There is another layer that becomes visible once the bond loosens enough. Sometimes what you kept attached was not just the person or the pattern, but the idea that your life would make sense if this bond eventually resolved. You gave the relationship interpretive power. You made it a key to your own story. As long as it remained unfinished, part of you kept believing the future would clarify the past. Letting go then becomes not only an emotional release, but a surrender of the idea that one person must redeem an entire chapter of your becoming. That surrender can feel like loss of meaning until something deeper replaces it. You begin to realize that the meaning was never actually in whether they came back, chose you fully, explained themselves, or finally became who you hoped. The meaning is in what the bond exposed about your internal design. It revealed what your system confuses with love, what your longing is built around, what your body still equates with significance, and what kind of self you become when you are organized around another person's distance. That is not a small revelation. It is one of the most important forms of self-knowledge attachment can offer. Once that self-knowledge becomes embodied, the future begins to open differently. Not because you become cold or detached, but because you stop needing a bond to destabilize you in order for it to feel real. You become capable of recognizing a quieter kind of connection, one that does not need to enter through wound, urgency, or emotional ambiguity to matter. One that may feel less mythic at first because it is not feeding an old architecture, but is actually asking you to build a new one. This is often the hidden consequence of real release. You become available for a different emotional economy. You no longer need to be haunted to feel depth. You no longer need to be withheld from to feel desire. You no longer need uncertainty to make love feel alive. That changes not only who you choose, but who you can finally receive. Health stops feeling flat once your system is no longer calibrated to chaos. And still, even then, the old bond may occasionally return in feeling, memory, or dream. That does not mean you failed to release it. It may simply mean it has become part of your archive rather than your operating system. There is a difference between being visited by what once shaped you and being governed by it. The deeper work is learning that difference in real time, so that tenderness can exist without reclaiming authority. Eventually, the question stops being, how do I let go of this person? And becomes, who am I when I no longer organize my inner life around their echo? That is a more demanding question, but it is also the one that leads somewhere new, because once a bond no longer gets to define your center, you begin to feel what else has been waiting there all along. Not emptiness, but space. And space, once it is no longer feared, has a way of revealing what was never actually missing, only crowded out.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.